Hello, welcome to this Religion Media Centre briefing. Today we're discussing a report just out from the Church of England on the experience of working class clergy. It says it's issuing a cry for change. Its title, Let Justice Roll Down Like Waters, exploring the well-being of working class clergy in the Church of England. And here to discuss it, I have the authors of the report, Dr. Alex Fry and Dr. Sharon Jagger, the Church's new Director of Ministry, Canon Nick McKee, the Reverend Luke Larner, who's just published a book on theology in class, and the Bishop of Barking, Lynne Cullens, who is on the advisory group that commissioned the report. So, Bishop Lynne, I'm going to come to you first. Just explain something about the background to this report and why it was felt necessary to commission it.
The reason that this report has been commissioned, it's one of 5 focus studies as part of the Living Ministry Initiative, as you say, focusing on clergy well-being. This report in particular has been commissioned because of years, really, of feedback from church leaders, working class church leaders in the Church of England, who have felt that they are suffering from class bias in one way or another, whether that's because their regional accents haven't been welcomed, or there are lack of opportunities for advancement, or feelings of isolation or marginalisation. I mean, in the report itself, I thought there was a very poignant line that said, generally, I was just given a reduced sense of belonging. So for all of those reasons, lots of stories have come through over the years. My own story coming through discernment and selection as a single mum from a working class background as well. So lots of lived experience indicated that this was an issue that the church needed to address and thankfully wanted to address. And that's where this research has come from.
How groundbreaking would you say this is? I mean, what data have you already got on working class clergy?
I think the answer is not a lot. I mean, I would defer to my colleague Nick, who probably knows more than I do. I know we have started to collect socioeconomic data on people coming forward for ordination. And I think that is really, really welcome. As part of the change to the selection criteria for the Church of England, far more people are coming in from a broader range of backgrounds. So that data is really valuable. When you go forward into more senior positions, there's also socioeconomic data gathered at that point. So we will eventually be able to track people from expressing a vocation at the start, coming through discernment, coming through the selection process, and hopefully being able to track their ongoing trajectories to kind of see that there's no element of class bias there. But it's early days and we've still got work to do on that, I think is what I would say. Nick might have more on that than I do.
Thanks, Lynne. I'd really just want to echo what Bishop Lynne has said. In terms of, we've begun to gather data on this. This report is an important contribution to the work that we're beginning to address a history of the Church of England being overwhelmingly middle class. And we are committed as a church to being younger and more diverse. And part of that diversity needs to include facing up to some of the difficult inheritance that we have around class. I think the foreword to this report is very telling from the Archbishop of York, when he recognises that facing this is not easy, but it is essential if we are to be a Jesus Christ-centred and shaped church.
Okay, well, let's get some definitions before we start talking about some of the stuff that emerges in the report. Let's have the definition of class that you're working with. Sharon.
This is a tricky question, and it might sound like I'm dodging the question somewhat, but we have asked participants to define class for themselves. So when we sent out a call for participants, we said, you are self-identifying as working class. For some participants who talked to us, they didn't have a particular regional accent, or they felt that they were now very well off in comparison to their backgrounds. So some felt very conflicted about whether they qualified for the research, but we assured participants that because there are nuances and difficulties really in pinning down a definition of class, we invited people to define it for themselves out of their experience and how they would really describe themselves.
So that's something about how the participants identify. Did you not have a definition of class that you were working to as a researcher, because you've researched into this area, haven't you?
Yes, and obviously I'll allow Alex to kind of flesh out some of these answers as well, because the idea of class is about a socio-economic relationship between groups of people. We absolutely understand that, for instance, the Registrar General has a list of occupations that are part of defining class, but clergy people are within the top. I think they're in the top 2, like academics are. So that can't really help us very much when we're talking about cultural experiences of class. So we have to sort of cast the net a lot wider, and it's to do with backgrounds, to do with how folks are brought up, whether they have had barriers in educational experience, whether they're from a particular housing tenure. I mean, it really is quite varied, but there are some threads, some common ideas of what class means to people. And often that's to do with background, and one person put it really well. It was having limitations to opportunity felt like a really good definition in order to invite lots of people in with their experiences. So it's that notion of not having all the opportunities available to other people.
Okay, right, now let's have another definition from you this time, Alex. Let's have a definition of well-being.
Well-being is another one of those tricky terms, but over the last decade or so, there's been a definition suggested that we've adopted that is used very widely now in well-being research. And essentially, well-being is an equilibrium or a balance between challenging life experiences on the one hand and our ability to cope with them on the other. And we have well-being when we have that equilibrium, when we have the resources to deal effectively with challenges to our well-being or to challenging life experiences. So that's the definition that we've adopted in our study.
So the research draws on interviews with 50 individuals. Tell me something about the makeup of the group that selected themselves for interview. Sharon.
It's a fairly broad mixture of traditions, for example. There's a fairly even number of men and women. We absolutely acknowledge that it's a white cohort. So we are absolutely writing from the perspectives of white working class clergy. And we do talk about that in the report as being a limitation in some ways. But because our methodology was about self-selection, we acknowledge that there's some work to do to bring in other voices and perhaps match up with the previous report that looked at experiences of global majority heritage clergy. And so we're really aware that this is sort of one perspective that we're talking about.
I just wonder why global majority heritage clergy didn't contribute, whether they're surveyed out. It's a possibility, I suppose. But Luke, you contributed to this report. It's obvious you're a survivor of the process of discernment and training and so on. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been available to the surveyors, would you, as a clergy person? But why did you feel it was important to contribute to this report?
I suppose for me, this is an area that I'm interested in terms of my academic work and my ministry as a priest. But not only that, this has been my life experience, and I was really interested to see how this report would tackle such a complex and challenging issue, particularly within the context of the Church of England as the established church in this country. So I was really, really interested in the research process, what it would come out with, and most importantly, I think the recommendations that the report would make for what needs to change, because ultimately that's the name of the game, isn't it, with a report like this? And I congratulate Alex and Sharon and those involved in doing a really good piece of work here.
Did you have any reservations about the study?
I think class is extremely complex to define, as we've already said. And there's something maybe dangerous in taking the self-selecting approach, although, I mean, being a researcher myself, I get that. There was an article in the press a while ago that a huge percentage of people see themselves as working class when asked in the UK. So without a concrete definition of what we mean by working class, that there is an inherent danger in that. And I suppose the angle in my own work in looking at this would be coming at it more from a sort of theological perspective, rather than as a piece of sort of participatory research. So I think they're both useful approaches. I think it's not so much a reservation, but it's sort of not the only way to approach
broader questions
things.
to ask, broader questions
Yes.
to ask than attempted here. If we can come to some of the findings of the report, I mean, I suppose the very obvious one that's right up there is about the financial well-being of working class clergy. Things like not having a house to retire to, so that, you know, when you retire, you don't just lose your income, you lose your housing as well. Alex, can you just speak a little bit to those financial vulnerabilities that people were talking about?
Yes, absolutely. And in actual fact, it's not just when it comes to retirement. In the Church of England, when you're first ordained to a curacy role, that is very much a fixed term position, to use more secular language. And so participants or dialogue partners would discuss with us, for example, they've reached the end of their curacy, which is 3 to 4 years. There are particular financial strains at the moment because of COVID-19, and in some cases, they're being advised to dip into savings. Well, of course, to have any savings, let alone enough to compensate for a lack of a stipend or a salary, is something that is not afforded to many people from working class backgrounds. That's much more of a middle class luxury. And so that has significant implications for well-being when it comes to anxiety, but also when it comes to financial material security, not least because, as you've alluded to, clergy's homes are tied with their job.
Do we know, Nick, whether some people are put off discerning whether they've got a call for ministry at all because of the financial pressures and implications of it?
We don't have data around that specific aspect of vocations. What we do know is that there are a range of factors that can either encourage or discourage people from exploring a potential call to ministry in the Church of England. Chief amongst them, actually, is their parish clergy, the existing parish clergy, and whether they can see the potential in those that they're ministering amongst, and the potential call that the Lord may be calling them into ministry in the church.
I'm just wondering about what the other obstacles to exploring a vocation are for working class clergy. I mean, Luke, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that. I mean, there was somebody in the report who said that every member on her selection panel was male, Southern, and spoke the Queen's English. I mean, I just wonder what struck you from the report about what people were saying about that.
I think those barriers are there, and some of them are cultural barriers, some of them are material barriers to do with wealth. I had a tiny amount of savings when I started training, and that had all gone by the end of training, and I've not managed to put any back in since. So there are those kinds of barriers. I think for me personally, I just couldn't believe that the Church of England would consider somebody like me for ministry. I was a bricklayer for 10 years before I entered the process. And I just couldn't imagine that was even a possibility. Obviously, I'm here, so I was proven wrong in that sense. But then there are those sort of milestone moments, like the Bishop's Advisory Panel, as it used to be called. And I remember going into my pastoral interview for that, and that was the one I was actually least worried about, because the person was like me, had been a homeless chaplain in a homeless day centre. So I thought, oh well, we'll have a good rapport because we've got that shared thing. And the first words that came out of their mouth in the interview, as they sort of sat there with my life in paper in their hands, were, "Gosh, you've lived a colourful life, haven't you?" And I sat there and thought, no, not really. I don't think I have lived compared to the Queen or Mother Teresa, maybe. But so there are some of those sorts of barriers, and that it started the interview off on completely the wrong foot because it got my back against the wall immediately. Now, yeah, I made it through, but I'm sure there have been others that didn't.
And I'm just wondering about the sort of training, the different training options that are available for the different needs of clergy. I mean, it might be a bit crude, but I suppose my assumption is that working class ordinands will go to Westcott House in Cambridge, a residential training course, and working class ordinands who need to keep working through their training might go to a non-residential training. Now, is that a fair generalisation to make, Nick?
I'm not sure that's quite the characterisation that would echo with my own experience of working in vocations at diocesan level. It's more about whether or not people are offering for stipendiary paid ministry, which will be a full-time ministry that they'll exercise. In general, those people train on full-time pathways, regardless of their educational background and their socio-economic background. And those who are offering for voluntary self-supporting ministries that is part of their life will train on a part-time pathway. Sorry, Rosie.
Right. And isn't it going to be much harder, really, for working class clergy to go for a self-supporting ministry because they are far less likely to be able to support themselves? Bishop Lynne? Not
necessarily. I mean, it depends the job that they do. I was a self-supporting minister when I first left curacy, and I worked for a charity for a year, and was a self-supporting minister alongside that. I mean, the danger of that for working class clergy is because there's a danger of over-committing. So if you're working full-time, like I was working full-time, I was single parent to 3 kids, and I was a self-supporting minister as well. If the temptation then is to, working class people in a middle class church tend to be people pleasers. So they tend to be asked to do things and don't like to say no. So that's a real danger. Is that you tend to overcommit, and that can be bad for well-being too. I mean, I suppose that the real thing that I think we need to be aware of is that working class clergy, I think, and I don't know what the research would say, what the stats are around this, I think working class clergy certainly were less likely to be given residential options for training, more likely to be given part-time routes because they're seen as having less academic potential, and therefore not worth the investment. So I think that would probably be my experience of that, really.
Alex, can you speak a little bit about what people were telling you in the report about their pathways to ordination?
Full-time residential training could be a barrier because of the financial implications, particularly for people with families, but not only people with families, obviously. So that barrier was definitely there. Another barrier for those going to full-time residential training was the culture as well. It was a very different culture that many of the people we spoke to were used to. Now, training college can be an opportunity for people to have to kind of cultivate useful ministerial networks that will serve them well moving forward. But actually, what people who I spoke to mentioned were that those who were from much more middle class backgrounds were far more able to do that and found that a much more natural part of their formational process or their time in training than those from working class backgrounds. So not only was there a reported barrier getting into residential college in the first place, but also for those who did make it, once they were there are other cultural barriers in place, which made things more difficult for them, for their families, and had well-being implications, including even strains on marriages, for example.
Luke, you want to underline what's just been said, I think, about your own experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with what Alex has just said. And I think there's barriers for all kinds of different families and single people as well. But for me, it wasn't just the culture clash for my family. I mean, I wouldn't have dreamed to go and do a residential Oxbridge training, because I would have been very anxious about fitting in. And that's not to do with the academic ability. I was quite confident in that. I discovered a reasonable amount of academic ability thanks to the church paying for me to have an education. But it's my family as well. I mean, my wife got her first GCSE last year at the age of 40, and she's one of 7 kids, and she's the only one that has one. And I knew that for us as a family, being in that environment would have been so alien and so stressful. I didn't. It wasn't even a consideration. Now, it's worth saying that residential pathways aren't the only full-time training options. So I did a full-time context-based training whereby I was able to stay in the urban working class environment where I'd been working as a lay minister. So those sorts of shapes of training work really well. But I would want to emphasise, and I think this comes out in the report, what I really don't like to see is when there's a narrative I've seen where people talk about the education side of it being a barrier to working class people. Now, I've found the fact that the church has gifted me with a higher education that I never would have been able to get otherwise has been life-changing for me in many ways, and liberating for me. I think there's things we can do to make it easier for people to engage in that education from working class backgrounds. I think we can have a more vocation focus without dumbing down any of the academic side of it. But yeah, I think those barriers are there, and they are both cultural and material.
Can we talk a little bit about what happens once you're through and you're in your curacy, you're in the church, and there's a lot in the report, Sharon, about people's need to fit in, feeling they're not quite sort of cutting it in some way, either because of the way that they speak, or because they haven't learnt to like gin and olives, or something like that. I mean, can you perhaps just give a few examples of where you were really struck by some of the things that people said to you?
I mean, in terms of tastes and hobbies, things like that, ways people dress, those all came out in the stories. But before I do give some examples, can I just absolutely underline that the report is not about people fitting in. We were very clear, and our participants were very sort of strong on how we oriented the discussion, that it's not about individual working class people altering themselves to fit in. We in fact turn the spotlight the other way and ask, why are there these barriers and cultural differences that make people feel that like they don't belong? Those need to be dismantled and challenged. Obviously it's quite difficult when you're talking about embedded cultures, but if we can raise awareness that these are the experiences of some people, some working class people, then the church has a chance to kind of address that on a cultural level. So it's absolutely not about individuals working to fit in. However, our participants did talk about the emotional energy and labour, the extra labour that is required for them just to be at dinner parties, for example. One person talked very much about not having a rich cultural life because of lack of money, lack of resources, and then being frozen out of conversations, in particular social circles, not having enough to talk about holidays, for example. So it's those fairly mundane, banal experiences that hurt the most, really, and that sense of I'm being judged or I'm seen as less valued. And other things in terms of hobbies, we often had stories that talked about certain hobbies being seen as less worthy. And in our conversations with Luke in a podcast that is now available, which was a really interesting, brilliant conversation, but he absolutely talks about how some some sins are working class sins. So the things that working class people do and are brought up to do, it might be swearing, smoking, going to the bingo, are framed in very particular ways that are not really a part of a Christian doctrine, but seem to appear to be. So there are those kinds of stories that came across very strongly to us.
Nick McKee, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, because you were trying to get in earlier. So do you want to add anything to this?
There's a couple of things I'd just pick up. One would be really to emphasize and support what Sharon and Luke have just said. You could give a headline here that says, actually, it's the church that needs to change. It's not about the people needing to change. You know, that's actually what the Archbishop of York picks up in the foreword to this report, saying that the church, if we are to become Jesus Christ centered and Jesus Christ shaped, then Jesus Christ was a carpenter from Nazareth. We need to be honest about the working class roots of Christianity and rediscover those and allow the church to inhabit that as part of being younger and more diverse.
One of the sort of recommendations that struck me was the recommendations to the archbishops, which is about transparency in the selection of people for posts within the Church of England, particularly senior posts. I mean, was that something that came across in the report, Alex? Were people saying that, you know, they felt that preferment wasn't open to them because they were working class?
Yes, certainly. So, for example, one person said to me that they received a phone call to say that they would never be shortlisted for a cathedral dean's post, and that was in part because of their working class regional accent. So that's one example of several that were expressed to me, and I believe Sharon also heard many other similar examples. So it's not just an implicit bias in some cases, it's actually explicit as well.
I mean, one of the problems, I suppose, in challenging decisions like that is the rather ambiguous position of the Church of England as an employer or not, and clergy as employees or not. Does that mean that it's difficult, Alex, for clergy to actually challenge some of the decisions that might be made about their career?
Certainly, it's not the same as someone like me who's employed in the public sector. There is I suppose, an unusual relationship between the church as an employer, not employer, and its office holders. I think one of the things that probably makes it more difficult is the relatively isolating nature of a lot of parish ministry. And of course, most clergy in the Church of England are in parish ministry in some form or another. So that is certainly a factor, I would say, yes.
One of the things the report talks about is union membership. I don't know how many people are in the Faith Unite branch of Unison, Luke, but I'm pretty sure that you are. Can you tell me about how increased membership among clergy might help working class clergy sort of assert themselves within the church?
Absolutely. So Unite the Union has a faith workers branch, and within that branch we have an organisation called Seeker, which is the Church of England Clergy and Employee Advocates, and that's open to all people employed within the Church of England, whether they're clergy or not. And one of the things we're hearing, I'm a member of that branch and quite involved in my local expression of that branch, and a lot of the things that come up in our support of our members and our casework are very similar to the things that have been brought up in this report. They have to do with things like conditions, pay, lack of transparency in structures, the feelings of being done to, the really opaque nature of the kind of organisational structure of the Church of England, which is it's not a monolithic institution. You've got a diocese and it works in a slightly different way. Then you've got this challenge of not being employees, which being office holders, which is being challenged, I know. I would say actually this relates very directly back to the first question we started this conversation with, which is how do we define what it means to be working class? To me, to be working class relates to a set of labour relationships. It's to do with our work, it's to do with our pay, it has to do with wage theft, it has to do with access to the means of production. Therefore, for me as a working class person, to survive in this environment with this lack of transparency, with this lack of kind of employment law and all of this stuff, actually at times I feel there's a risk of almost moral injury to participate in a structure which I'd say is harmful to the working class on the whole. Therefore, I think to enable people to have a voice and to be heard, unionisation, I'd say, is key, and I think that's where the change comes, is when there's a lot of great recommendations in the report about this, like the idea of reverse coaching, the idea of the voices of lived experience being able to speak to the decision makers and power holders without fear of repercussions, because to be honest, what we're hearing from our union members is people are afraid to say what they really think to the power holders.
Bishop Lynne, the idea of reverse coaching, do you do some of that in the College of Bishops of which you're a member?
There is a real lack of awareness of, in the House of Bishops particularly, there is a great, it's monocultural really, and that needs to change. And we're talking about transparency, and you know, the entry into the House of Bishops is, you know, shrouded in some element of secrecy, and that shouldn't be the case. And I think until our appointment systems are made transparent, we won't have the trust in the process that we should have. You know, the marks of mission, our fourth mark of mission, is that we challenge unjust structures, and we need to start with ourselves. We need to take the log out of our own eye before we go looking for the splinter elsewhere.
Yeah, I know that the revolution starts from the bottom up, but actually, I mean, what should the College of Bishops be doing to make sure that change comes from top down?
Well, the College of Bishops can't do anything because the College of Bishops has no power. So the governance power rests with the House of Bishops.
Okay, forgive me, House of Bishops.
But the House of Bishops should, I think, be listening to this report. I would really encourage the Church of England to adopt the recommendations of this report. It's been a long time coming. I'm absolutely delighted to see this report, to see the church looking at issues of class, embracing the changes that are going to be necessary for all of God's children to thrive within the Church of England. And as part of that, I think change will come. I think change will come to all the appointment systems. But there isn't a level of the church that isn't affected by class bias.
Final question really for you all, because we're running out of time, whether it's by revolution or evolution, what's the one change that you think that this report can or should deliver? I'll start with you, Sharon.
I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, to pinpoint one change. The report talks a lot about agency, so maybe this is where we start, that working class clergy have sometimes, and they've told us this in story form as well, feel that they don't have control over their own destiny in the Church of England, and feel very much stereotyped sometimes that because they're working class they should be interested in working in ministering to working class areas, however you define those, which is another thing to talk about. So I think from my point of view, it would be working on that, allowing folks to decide for themselves how they're going to be trained, whether they actually do want to be self-supporting or whether they want to be paid for their labour, and then where they want to be deployed. So agency, I think, is one thing I would really like to highlight.
Alex?
The other side of that coin would be seeing this report as something of a mirror that's being held up to the Church of England, except what being seen actually comes from clergy from working class backgrounds. And it's my hope that this will be as uncomfortable as it might be, an opportunity for greater levels of self-awareness, self-reflection, that taking the log out of your own eye that Bishop Lynne was alluding to, in order to create institutional level change.
Nick.
I think I'd say something very similar to Alex. This, for me, is an important contribution to a conversation that needs to continue. There'll be further research that's needed. And it may be painful, indeed, I'm confident that it will be painful for the church to face up to the classism that exists. But we need to face up to that in the same way as we're working to face up to the racism in the life of the church. They're all forms of discrimination, and we need to be honest about where we are if we're to address them and change in the way that we need to.
Bishop Lynne, we've already spoken about how things might change within the House of Bishops. Is there another sort of change which you hope this report might deliver?
In the end, representation matters. So it matters that we have working class clergy to work across our country, because it makes people feel that God, in some way, is speaking through them, that it's somebody with a similar background, similar life experience. So representation matters. So if we have clergy who are from working class backgrounds, who have good sense of their belonging in the church, of their ability to express the fullness of themselves within their ministry, then I think we will be missionally so much more effective. I think we need apostles from the working class to evangelize the working class. And I really hope this report will land well. And I am genuinely excited about it. After 10 years of working in this area, this is a major move forward.
Luke, finally, if the church takes this report seriously, how different might the church look in 10 years' time?
I would want to point to one of the recommendations, which says that the Church commissions further research that examines more deeply how its structures, systems and culture reproduces class inequality, with a view to illuminating privilege in all its guises. I'd want to actually go a step further than that. I would want to say not just privilege, but power, because they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
I would say we need to start to grapple with power. So we join, I would say, with the Christ of the poor, who is present in the labour struggles of people across the world, the working people across the world. So I would want to see the church pick a side. The old Union song says, which side are you on? What side are we going to pick in this struggle?
And I was very struck by some of the closing comments on the report, where some respondents said that, yeah, it's great to have a project focusing on working class clergy, but let's look in the other direction as well, and let's have the Church commission its report on privilege within the Church of England, and keep looking both ways, and not just one, because that's the only way that change will come about. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time with me this evening. I'm sorry we haven't had longer. There is much more digging into that report to be done, and I'd like to point people to the report. We'll have a link up to it on our website. Do go there and read around. Thank you.